Hello and welcome to Providence Healthcare's virtual dialogue on aging session. This is the second in our winter series. My name is Mark Blanford. I'm the Vice President of Seniors Care and Clinical Operations here at Providence Healthcare, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session. Unfortunately, we're providing it online instead of in person due to COVID, but hopefully you'll get just as much out of this session virtually as you may have done in person. These sessions are designed to link seniors and others interested in seniors' well-being and care from across British Columbia with researchers and experts in the field. If you're interested in any of our prior sessions, please go to our website. I'm sure somebody after me will tell you exactly how to get to that website and check out some of our previous sessions. I'm sure you won't be disappointed. My apologies today that I'm not with you in person. I think this is the second time I've done a recorded greeting, so I hope it comes across reasonably well. But I just want you to know that these sessions have the full support of the seniors leadership here at Providence Healthcare, and we're very much hoping that you'll get as much out of the sessions as we have putting into the planning. Today's sessions look really fascinating, focused on dementia, something that all of us in seniors care are interested in and look at every day. I hope that you'll find the sessions interesting. I'd love to hear Myrna's talk. Love to hear Susan and Kathy today. These are conversations I think that are very important for us to have, and I hope you'll participate when the opportunity gives rise to itself. In terms of, I was asked to comment on our vaccine distribution here at Providence. We've done extremely well in Providence Healthcare. We're about 90% vaccinated for COVID-19 in both in all 5 of our long-term care sites, and that indeed is the case across the Lower Mainland here in Vancouver. We're probably around 80% in terms of our staff vaccination. Lots of probably about 20% of our population, staff population, is younger. Childbearing years, those individuals have possibly chosen to not have the vaccine. We also have a number of people who with health conditions that preclude them. So we're about 80% vaccinated in our staff in long-term care. Still pretty good rates when you consider that during a regular flu season, we're probably somewhere in the 60% range. So good uptake on the vaccine. We're hopeful of it helping us manage the COVID situation significantly better than we've been able to this point. And so far on the Lower Mainland here in Vancouver, we don't have a single outbreak in long-term care, which is unusual. The last 6 months we've had at least a few on the go. So we're hopeful for the future. We believe we might be turning the corner with COVID, and hopefully getting back to something approaching normal in all of our senior settings. So enough for me. I do once again welcome you to the session, and I hope to enjoy it myself in a recorded fashion later. So thank you for your time.
I never knew I could do art. I didn't have a clue. Like Susan said, I couldn't draw a stick man. And then I learned that it isn't about the end product, although I've fallen in love with all my products. It is the process of doing it. I made this mask in my living room with my husband and I, looking at all these materials that I had been given by Susan and Gloria. And I just had a blast doing this project. If you notice the 3 little flowers down at the bottom, those are 3 roses from some old earrings I've had around forever. And the Band-Aid on the person's brain. That was a nice little touch, but it's not all negative. There's lots of positivity in this piece, and I love it. I'm hoping you can see this one. This mask was made by a carer, and I've talked to her about it because see how it's been torn away? she feels that she's lost part of herself by the heavy burden of caring um, for her loved one with dementia. And isn't that amazing that she was able to put these thoughts, these really deep hurts on a piece of art and be able to let it out by doing that? That's really what art's all about. Um, the words on this mask, um, they all go to how to be more positive, how to make choices to have the best life you can have instead of just going home and getting your affairs in order. Art gives us this, and it doesn't matter what type of art, whether it's collage, whether it's masked, whether it's painting, storytelling, poetry. It just really opens the door for us to feel comfortable with not only ourselves, but the others around us.
Thanks, Myrna. And I'm so glad you shared the other mask that you have the picture of behind you there, because each one was so unique and depicted so many different things about dementia. So I want to say just a little bit now about the art making. Oh, yeah, this is the project slide, right? I'm getting ahead of myself here. This is a project that was funded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. And as I mentioned before, was really focused on the topic of how do people live well with dementia? And in particular, what in the art making workshops did people want others to know about this? Because we realized that in order to counteract this dominant story about dementia's decline, we need to have a community that is actively aware and involved and understands what it means to live well with dementia. So in our project, we had 3 phases. We did interviews with people to start, and then we moved into these art making workshops, which was really an opportunity to work together and individually to create artwork about living well with dementia and about the challenges. And then in the 3rd phase, which because of COVID, we had to move online, we created an online art exhibition that showcased more than 60 works that came out of these workshops. And we've mounted that, and I will provide you with the link to it at the end of this presentation so you can take a look for yourself. Next slide, please. So here's an example of one of the beautiful collages made by Cindy. And this expresses her perspective as a carer for her husband with dementia, about all the things that meant so much to both her and her husband in living well with dementia. And you can see she has used a variety of natural materials here. There was fresh moss and some twigs and little flowers she brought with her to put on this bush to depict the many branches of living well with dementia. Next slide, please. So the workshops themselves were, we were very fortunate in that we did have an opportunity to have 4 workshops in person before COVID. And we came together in the North Burnaby Community House, and we had a session, well, 4 different sessions there, making artwork, and involved 24 people, about half of whom had dementia and half were care partners. One of the things we strive to do when we were setting up the workshops and having interviews with people in preparation was to find out what kind of materials they were naturally drawn to, so that we could provide a whole range of things to make and to do in art making, and that everyone would have something that appealed to them. So there was a great array of materials, and setting up for these workshops involved Gloria and myself and Natasha and others bringing baskets of pine cones and fabric and old typewriters and clay for modeling, all these kinds of things that we could use together to make art. In this photograph, you see a warm-up activity that we did, which is called Wet on Wet. And you had a wet page, and we would start at one station and put some blobs of color on, and then everyone would put down their brush and move to the next station and continue working on the piece for the station next to them. And so as you moved around the table, everyone worked on each of these pieces, and it was a very collaborative kind of shared art making session where nobody could get too attached to the outcome, because no matter what you painted, someone else was going to come along behind you and put their own stick their own mark on it. So that was a lot of fun. Next slide, please. And this is one of the other activities that we did. One of our participants had been a very proficient naturalist and had always loved the outdoors, knew a lot about plants. He was usually very quiet and soft-spoken, and so we thought in creating an activity to do together at the beginning of the workshop, we would use all natural materials and enable him to work with things that he would feel very comfortable with and knowledgeable about. And so this was a group activity. We spent maybe half an hour listening to quiet music, and everyone picked materials up off the table, and we made this mandala out of all these beautiful natural materials. This was a very kind of meditative activity, and people really got deeply involved in placing things on the canvas and in trying to put them in such a way that they mirrored something that they recalled seeing in nature, or that they mimicked a pattern in nature. And then when we talked about the activity of creating it, this fellow, one of our participants, was actually very talkative. He felt so very comfortable and so very calmed by this activity. The next slide, please. So these are some thoughts that we had after doing a number of these workshops, some in person and some actually online as well after COVID, that it was really important to take what we call a strength-based approach. And that involves figuring out for people what they enjoy doing, what kind of materials they're drawn to, what will make them feel confident and able to undertake this activity. To build some confidence through working with things that are familiar, such as the natural mandala that I mentioned. I'm just having trouble seeing the bottom of the slide because of the texting here. Okay, and promoting discovery also through working with unusual things. So people were, kind of enabled to pick up something they'd never tried before. We had people doing sculpture with clay, and people who had never written poetry sitting down at, we had old typewriters that would go clackety, clackety, clack, and those were kind of fun. So there were all these opportunities to try something new as well as something more familiar. As I've already mentioned, we did some activities that were individual and some that were more kind of co-creative. And we tried to engage people in ways that fostered new relationships, so that it wasn't always, one table of people with dementia and another table of carers, or we mixed it up and we all became collaborators, co-creators in this research endeavor. I can remember sitting down next to somebody and making a collage with ferns, and another time finding that I was having a wonderful conversation with another participant about the jams and jellies that she liked to make in the summer, and I made a little clay blueberry pie. And so it was very much a kind of conversation that is sparked by the creative process, but also the activity of our hands. There's a lot of really interesting research that shows that when our hands are active, our brain is active and we're engaged. And so, for example, if you doodle while you're on the telephone, chances are you will remember what you talked about in the conversation you just had more than if you don't, if your hands are idle. Those are kind of interesting just things to know about how we process and and how things stick. Next slide, please. So Myrna, this is one of your creations I most love, your painting called Sailboat. Would you like to talk about what went into this one for you?
It ended up being kind of interesting. I really like color. I love yellows and oranges and browns and rusts, and oh, I love color. And so I was just playing around with the color, and you can see up in the corner that I started kind of with red. To tell you the truth, I don't know how the sailboat ended up in there because I was so engrossed in the process of experimenting, and I did some scraping there, and I'd never done that before. And when I finished it, and looked at it, and others around me were looking at it, I did create a sailboat. To me, it's a sailboat in a storm, but not a cold, dreary storm, a storm of love and light. And yeah, I have it in my wall here.
Next slide, please. So one of the things we found was after making art and usually having a cup of tea and something we bake to bring to share, it was really important to talk about the art making. As Myrna's just said, you know, sometimes it's not until you've made something and you look at it again or you start to tell someone else about it that you realize what it means to you. And so this particular piece, which is called Splash, was one that provoked a lot of discussion in one of our circles that we had to share the artwork after making it. And we rotated it around a couple of times, sometimes with the dark at the top and sometimes with the dark at the bottom. And it was very interesting to see that people interpreted it differently, and it became a kind of a metaphor for the journey with dementia, moving either from out of the darkness and into the bright, the yellow, like Myrna's painting, or for other people, worries about the future and moving from the bright into the dark. And so this artwork became quite a provocative piece for us beginning to understand how people think about their trajectory with dementia and how they see themselves, what their worries are, but also where they're drawing real strength in moving toward the light and toward the yellow. Next slide, please. Here's a couple more examples of things that, this is one called, it's an unfinished piece by Jack, who had a great affinity for wood and for, I believe, selling furniture or wall coverings in his working life. And he took these pieces, and while he was assembling this collage, he described all the different veneers that he knew and that he worked with, and to the point that, you know, people who knew him turned and looked at him in astonishment with the detail of the stories he was sharing about the wood and the pieces he'd chosen for this particular artwork. I find it personally a very intriguing piece to look at, with the little stone that is poised just on the edge of the wooden stick there, you know, balanced perfectly almost. And yet there's a sense that something's about to happen with it. And I found this a very intriguing piece. Myrna, I don't know, I mean, this one speaks to me of how important it was in our discussions for people to be allowed to interpret work according to their own life experience. What do you see in this one?
I see very much the same as you explained. But what was so important in this whole session was, in our circle, which was everybody that had made some artwork, we all talked about the piece. and it was almost like a love-in. Like everybody was really pleased for everyone else's work. And our brains were stimulated to think about pieces of art like this one. Unfortunately, I wasn't there when Jack made this particular piece. And so I missed that essence of him and his work throughout his life. But I just love the rock teetering on that piece of wood and knowing that something's going to happen, but what is it? I really like it.
Next slide, please. And this is, I think, probably the last of the images we have to share with you, called a photograph called Swooping Heron, from one of our participants who would prefer not to be named, but who is an extraordinary photographer. This is a beautiful, beautiful image that they've captured here. Alongside it, you'll see here, this is the artist statement, and this has come from directly from the website, the online exhibition I mentioned. And I just draw your attention to one part of this. This person's talking about being in the park and fiddling with their camera, and then suddenly seeing the blue heron swooping down from nowhere. When I look at that picture long enough, it feels like he's gliding, skimming through the water. I get a bit nostalgic looking at it because it looks like my journey with dementia. Someone else might see a different kind of journey, something difficult they've experienced. So I think that beautifully expresses the way that creativity can be an avenue for us to discover what we feel and think, but also in sharing it generously with others, it enables them to have a similar kind of reflective process and understand something they're going through in a new way. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is the link to the art exhibition, and I highly recommend you all go and check it out. It's called In There, Out Here, Art Making Space to Live Well with Dementia. And that is the website. If you just go to artmakingspace.com, you will be taken into the exhibition and guided through the collage, the painting, the poetry, and other pieces that this work resulted in. And we'd love to hear from you with your feedback on that if you take a look at it. So last slide, please. Last slide, please. One more couple of things we just wanted to mention. Myrna has written a book about living well with dementia, and I think the slide what follows this one has some details on it about the book, but this is just an extract from her book that is packed full of wonderful tips and ideas, and it's Myrna's description about how to make a collage. So if you're not quite sure how to get started, we thought, let's share that with you. Did you want to comment on that? And then maybe in the next slide, tell folks a little bit about your book.
Sure. Because making this collage was so much fun, and it's something my husband and I worked together on rather than just discuss. We actually did it together, and it was joyful. And I loved making it, and I loved the interaction between my husband and myself and the kinds of things we talked about as we were finding things to put on our particular collage. My collage was about sort of dementia before, while there was a lot of stigma, and then once a person overcame the stigma, how life could open, almost like a flower, life could open and you realized you had choices. And so I wanted everybody else to share, if they wanted, that particular feeling that I had from making that. And ever thinking of Susan and Gloria, because they opened this whole world to me. And if I can just open it for one more person, then that's wonderful. So I actually wrote a book. I wrote a book about strategies and tips. Although I have probably more personal stories than strategies and tips, what I wanted to do was just write a book that somebody could just read while sitting having a cup of coffee. It takes a couple of hours. It's like sitting down at a restaurant having a cup of coffee with your friend and you're just chatting. Some of the tips are things that I've kind of learned the hard way. My famous one is telling people about using hair removal instead of toothpaste because I had too many tubes and couldn't distinguish. But the comments I'm getting from people who have read my book have said that it feels very much like just sitting down and having a lovely conversation. I wouldn't allow any auditing. That's the wrong word. I wouldn't allow any corrections on my sentence structure or my spelling. It's just from me to you, and that's the way I wanted it. We actually put it out on November the 7th, and I sold a lot of books to people who have somebody with dementia either in mind, or they're worried that they may be getting dementia, or their parent has and they want to understand more. And so I'm really pleased. I'm pleased that it's meaning a lot to a lot of people.
I think there's one more slide with a poem. So Myrna, would you like to close us off with your final poem?
Sure, I would. Citizen Reclaimed. When we're searching for who we are and who we may be, arriving at that destination is not the finality of our journey, it's just the beginning. As we aspire to learn, to love, and to share, it allows us to open to giving, to receiving, and to sharing, to feel our innermost thoughts, to allow ourselves to begin our journey of joyous discovery of that inner joy. And that's what art's done for me.
The final slide, please. I'd just like to acknowledge others on the project team, both here in BC and in Washington, some of the artists and the students who worked with us, and all of the contributors to the artwork that goes into the online exhibition. And finally, to thank our funders, the Alzheimer's Society, the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research, and the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. Thank you so much for your attention. Myrna and I would be very pleased to have any comments or questions. I'm not able to see questions in the chat, but maybe someone can read them to us.
Well, thank you so much. I'll start off. I'll say thank you so much, Dr. Cox and Myrna. That was so inspiring. I think that you really lit a fire of excitement for all of us. I love the way that you analyzed the artwork. I thought that it was so meaningful, and it really helped to understand what people might have been thinking about as they put their artwork together. And Myrna, I loved how you bookended your poetry. That was so that you left us lifted, and sharing yourself that way. It's I think that's inspiring for other people to think about the possibilities that come from using art to share yourself. So I'm going to turn it over to Christine. If you're putting your written question in the chat box, excellent, and Christine can help anyone else who might need her help. So again, thank you, Dr. Cox, and thank you, Myrna.
Thank you, Barbara.
So actually, the first question is for Barbara Lindsay. And before we go into the other comments, there was a request for a bit of clarity about the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease.
Oh, I can understand that that's such an issue, you know, and I don't want to take time away from our beautiful presenters, but I'll quickly say that dementia is that overarching way to describe that collection of symptoms, and that that there are so many different kinds of dementia. Alzheimer's disease is one of the most common, and that's why we often say at the Alzheimer's Society, Alzheimer's disease and other dementias, because and the Alzheimer's Society supports people with no matter what kind of dementia that you have, and so that's the nuts and bolts of the answer. But we'd love to talk more to you, the person who asked the question. If you let Christine know, I would like to follow up with you. We can talk a little bit more. Thank you so much for your question.
Okay, and next question is from Cindy. And the question is, did each participant make their own mask before decorating them? And if so, what materials did you use for the mask?
Susan?
Oh, I can say a little bit, and then Myrna, you can add to it. We provided the cardboard. It's a hard cardboard mask. Both there's smaller and larger sizes depending on who's using them. And we provided those in a bag with an assortment of acrylic paints, some brushes, feathers, straw, ribbons, sequins, all kinds of collage materials, and dropped those off at people's homes so that they could make their masks. And then we had an online session where people shared the masks and we talked about them, and everyone got to see everyone else's mask and hear all about what went into it and what it meant to them. Did you want to add to that, Myrna?
Not too much, other than to say, and when we looked through this bag of goodies, and they were goodies that we got, then it also inspired us to look in our jewelry box, to have a look in our medicine drawer, to see what different kinds of things. I use seeds on one of mine because my new life as a person with dementia was a regrowth, and so I thought the seeds were important. So it's just finding whatever made you feel good and was doing the message you wanted it to make for yourself.
That's the beauty of collage, isn't it? You can use a whole bunch of things like broken jewelry or, you know, bits of old favorite cloth from a dress you loved, or, you know, you can incorporate almost anything into a collage.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And there are lots of positive remarks coming in here that are thanking for all of the sharing, the paintings, the poems. And the next question goes to Lori, and I'm just going to unmute her. Go ahead, Lori.
Hi there. Can you hear me? I'm on a Bluetooth streaming device for my hearing aid.
Yes, we can.
Okay. Wonderful, thank you. For one, I wanted to ask, and I just did in the comments, whether this session is being recorded and if we will receive the link.
Yes, you will.
Wonderful, thank you. The next was actually a comment. You have beautifully reminded me that in my work, which is for a community-based senior service provider, I had an art therapist do some work with some clients. It was a volunteer program, art therapy. It was back in 2014-15, I believe. And in particular, I was really struck by their explanations of the work, especially for the man who had entered his dementia. He was a newly diagnosed person with dementia. And it really came to pass that he found it was an incredible way to be able to communicate what he was feeling when he couldn't find the words. But he was able, although not an artist, to put things on paper that would prompt him to find the words that he needed to express his feelings. And after several months of that activity going on a weekly basis, the wife said, I really want to thank this therapist. I feel like I've got my husband back. I feel like I've got a way to communicate with him and to understand what's going on with him. So that was a real eye-opener for me about how powerful this can be. And I want to thank you all because I had forgotten that.
That's a
Thank you.
very,
Wonderful to share. Yeah.
yeah, very profound, isn't it? I mean, your poem speaks to this too, doesn't it, Myrna? The vulnerability at the time of diagnosis,
Yeah.
and and how hard that is, but how much growth is possible coming from that.
And I think it's interesting to ponder, how do we convince people to come out for things like that? This gentleman was pretty much dragged kicking and screaming into a room filled with women. And at the end, he was so grateful to find this means of communication. And so it really does just remind me about perseverance and how important the trust factors are for those of us who are facilitating community programs. Sometimes, it takes that time to build the trust with our clients so that they will take a leap of faith into an art class with a room full of women and really learn that they can get something out of it.
I'm really glad you've raised this topic because it's a very timely one. And I'm not sure if you've heard about the movement that I think it really began in the UK, which is Arts on Prescription, which is really about us beginning to integrate the healing value of creativity and the arts into our healthcare system in a much more comprehensive way so that physicians can actually prescribe that someone should go to the theater or someone should listen to music or go take a dance class. And there are a lot of people here in Canada, they're very interested in supporting that movement. It's underway in Ontario, and there are people here in BC who are equally interested in beginning to put things in place to support that.
That
I
is
also-
interesting. Very exciting.
Sorry, go ahead.
So I think we have time for one more quick question, and I'm going to go to Helen. Helen, go ahead. Oh, maybe we'll move to Bonnie. Bonnie? Bonnie, you're unmuted.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. This is Helen. I don't know if you're able to see a camera shot of what I'm trying to show you. Oh, okay. So I'm the Seniors Outreach Coordinator for the District of West Vancouver, and I've enjoyed all these talks, and I'm on all of these meetings with you guys. But I have done something. I've set up a Weaving Memories with looms. So I've given out the first 2 looms today to a couple. The husband is living with dementia, and he told me that he's very excited to learn a new craft. They're gone to the beach to pick up driftwood, because that's when they dated first. They used to walk Ambleside Beach. They're going to pick up driftwood, some shells, and he has some cufflinks that he wants to weave in to remind him of his business days when he worked in the travel industry. I really wish I could share the pictures of the looms that were kindly donated through a friend of mine who is working with recovering addicts, because they're absolutely beautiful. So the program is called Weaving Memories.
Is there anywhere we can look online to see this, or it sounds fascinating?
Yeah, I don't know how I can share it with you guys, because I do have a camera on here. I'd be happy to share if I have an email address I could send it to, but it's just a great way.
Helen, we can get that after the fact and put that in the newsletter that goes out to all the participants, if that's okay.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I just
I'll
wanted to
reach
share
out.
it. Yeah, for sure. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Helen.
You're welcome.
So I do see that we've got a couple more questions we didn't get to. So if you don't mind putting your questions in the chat, we will ask our speakers if they can respond, and we'll put the answers in the newsletter along with all the links and details like Myrna's email for the book. And Barb, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christine. So now we're going to have a little 5-minute break to stretch our legs before we hear from our next speaker. So Christine, I think about 2:07.
Yes, and we
Yeah.
do have a little exercise video, I believe, to assist us in our stretch.
That's exciting. And thanks so much again, Dr. Cox and Myrna Norman. That was a wonderful, wonderful and inspiring talk, and we were all so grateful.
It was a real pleasure for us to be here today. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
So we're going to just start doing some slow stretches. I want you to just sit up nice and tall in your chair and pull your shoulders back, roll them back, pinch your scapula together and pull your shoulders back, pinch your shoulder blades together and back. Do each of these exercises 5 to 10 times, depending on how much time you have in between your activities. Once you've done that, make sure your head and neck, your ear is in line with your shoulder. Tilt your head to the side and stretch your neck. And do that to the other side. Feel a nice gentle stretch at the side of your neck. Do that 5 times, 5 on each side, gently and slowly. You might want to hold it there and stretch. Hold it there and then switch. If you feel a nice stretch, you might want to hold it there longer. Usually one side of the neck is more tight than the other. And then you're going to rotate your head to the right, stretch, and back to the left, stretch, back to the center, to the center, to the left. If you want to get a little bit more stretch, you can use your hand. Give it a gentle push. You don't want to feel dizzy or anything when you're giving that overpressure. But sometimes our rotation at our neck is limited, so we want to be able to make sure you can check your blind spot when you're driving. Or when you're walking and crossing the street, you want to make sure you can do your shoulder checks when you're walking as well. Again, lift your arms up and stretch and reach up to the ceiling. Feel the stretch from your shoulder down to your waist. Do that 5 times. Give it a nice stretch. Reach up to the ceiling. Stretch. Feel a nice stretch all the way down to your waist. If you feel particularly stiff in your waist area, you can put one hand on your waist, one hand above, and stretch. Feel a nice stretch. Hold it there for about 5 seconds and then come back up. Do that again. Nice stretch. Feel the stretch all the way down the side of your trunk. 2. Do about 5 of them. 3, 4, and 5. So if you have one side that's more stiff than another, you can do 5, or you can alternate. You could do right and then left. My right side is stiffer than my left, so I like to give that a nice stretch. So you can do it alternate sides. Bring your arms above your head and stretch. Feel the stretch all the way from under your arms, all the way to your waist. You put your hands on your waist and you can stretch back and then relax. And stretch back and relax. When you're leaning in front of your computer, by the end of the day, you're probably leaning way far over. So you just need to do a reverse stretch. Stretch your back. Okay, when you're in the seated position, your pelvis is stabilized, so you can get a nice stretch from your base of your spine to your back. The other way you can do that is stand up, put your hands on your waist, and stretch back like this. Put your feet shoulder width apart so you're well balanced. Push back. And when you're doing a stretch, you want to hold it there. Stretch, 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 stretch. If it feels good, do a few more. If it causes you pain, then you should stop. You can put your hands here and rotate. You put your feet shoulder width apart. Rotate. Give your trunk a nice stretch. Do that about 5 to 10 times. If you do a lot of keyboarding, you might want to put your hands out and give your wrist a stretch. Do that. Stretch and hold it there. Do that about 5 to 10 times. Or you can do this, push out. If your wrists get tingly, it's a good one to do. Shake your hands out. Push out. Now when you're sitting, you're always sitting, you've got your hips and knees at 90, so your hamstrings might get a bit tight. So what you can do is you get a chair, you put one foot on top of the chair, and from your waist, lean forward, and you should feel a stretch down the back of your leg. It's your hamstrings. Now a lot of people, they tend to go forward and stretch this way, but we really want to focus on the hamstrings. So you want to be able to just flex at the waist and feel the stretch behind your leg. Okay, and stretch and hold it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do that 5 times. And then we're going to switch legs. Do your left. And again, lean forward from your waist. Feel a nice stretch behind your leg, all the way to the back of your knee. And hold it. 1, 2, 3.
Hi, everyone. We're just going to get switched over here and ready for our next presenter while you finish off stretching the other leg there. Hopefully you enjoyed that.
Well, welcome back from the break. Well, we're really excited to have another speaker this afternoon, and thank you so much, Dr. Pichora. Am I right to say Pichora? Oh, I'm so happy. Is that it right? Yeah, so Dr. Kathy Pichora, we're really delighted to have you here this afternoon. So I'm going to give you a little introduction to Dr. Pichora-Fuller. So Dr. Kathy Pichora-Fuller is a professor emerita of psychology at the University of Toronto and the adjunct professor of gerontology at Simon Fraser University. Her research program concerns auditory aging, and her clinical research concerns audiological rehabilitation for older adults. She has earned an international reputation for her interdisciplinary approach in linking research and on auditory and cognitive processing during communication in everyday life. So today, Dr. Pichora is talking about hearing, language, music, and breath health. So we will have time for questions later if you want to put them into the chat box, and we will have a short Q&A afterwards. So very much looking forward to your talk. Welcome, Dr. Pichora-Fuller.
All right, actually, let me just say that I really enjoyed the first presentation, and it gave me a lot to think about. And it's sunny here over on Bowen Island this afternoon, and I hope you're all still feeling creative, and that you did some of those exercises if they were safe for you to do, and you were listening to the instructions, and you were hearing some background music. So what I am going to do is kind of carry on this theme of creativity and art and look at some auditory ways in which you can be creative too. And I'm going to try to focus on also what we lose as we get older, but also how we can preserve and age well, whether or not we have sensory loss. So I am going to tell you some kind of boring details you probably already know about how our eyes and ears and balance systems and you know, all of our senses actually change with age, but I'll focus on hearing, but bring home that everything is connected and that all of this is connected to the rest of our health and also to our brain and how we basically use our senses as the gateway to the world as we go about our everyday activities. And then kind of like another version of the same story you heard in the first section about, well, what kind of sensory activities can you do to keep your brain healthy? And I'm going to kind of go the gamut from 40 to 120. I don't really see that this would not be relevant to anybody who is interested in any phase of aging, whether you'd like to prevent dementia or whether you'd like to live well with it. So we're going to do the whole gamut. And if we can just actually skip to the next slide. There we go. Okay, so let's just get some details about sensory loss. And I'm sure this is not going to be a surprise to you that your hearing and your vision, when you get older, they're not like the same way they were when you were 20. What you might not realize is that these are very, very common problems. So actually hearing loss and vision loss in studies on the global burden of disease, so looking at all the diseases you could possibly have, these are the second and third most common impairments. So we are all confronted by these changes, some with more severe changes than others. Go to the next slide. All right, so I would also like to share with you that the Canadian Institutes for Health Research has some fabulous national projects which involve hundreds of researchers. And one of them is the CLSA, the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, which I'm going to tell you about. And the companion project, which actually is looking at neurodegeneration, the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging, has multiple teams, but we are in Team 17. So there is research going on across Canada, and we are the team who looks at the sensory cognitive connections. So a lot of the work I'm going to present comes from the work of our team. And, you know, I come from audiology and psychology. Natalie Phillips is a neuropsychologist. Paul Mick is an otolaryngologist. Walter Wittich is an optometry. So it's a multi-professional team, a multidisciplinary team, because we want to put Humpty Dumpty back together again and understand how all these pieces fit. So your government is working for you. I hope you're glad to pay your taxes so that we can do our research. Next slide. Let me tell you a little bit about how we started with the CLSA data. So it began a while ago. It began in 2012-ish, and the first wave of data was being collected in 2015. And the way it goes is, at the beginning, people who were 45 to 85 years old, 30,000 people living in 10 different towns or cities across Canada were enrolled. Some of you may have been enrolled. At the beginning, they had no cognitive impairment. They were quite healthy. And we measured, a team of hundreds of scientists put this protocol together. What would we measure? So lots of biological measures, social measures, cognitive measures, how you use the healthcare system, all kinds of data is there. So it's a real treasure trove. And we have been working with the first wave. Now we're starting to work with the second wave. So every 3 years, for 20 years, these 30,000 Canadians are providing data so we can understand the whole process of getting older and hopefully find some ways that people can live better longer. So I'm going to just give you a little snapshot of what we found when we looked at the hearing measure. Same kind of hearing test as you might have if you went to a clinic. And we're going to break it into mild loss and moderate loss, a vision test, just like you might have if you went to an optometrist. So where you look at letters and we find out how small the letters can be for you to see them, and also a balance test. And this kind of reminded me like what we were doing in the intermission, because it was a measure of how long could you stand on one foot to measure your balance. So you all just gave yourself a test of that during the intermission. Next slide. All right, so I know that you're not all scientists, but maybe some of you would like to see some graphs, but if you don't, just close your eyes and listen to me. So we have the auditory counts of people in that Canadian sample at different ages, and how many of them, if you click on the slide, please, how many of them had a mild loss? How many had a moderate loss? So way more people have a mild loss, but there are still quite a lot of people with a moderate loss. And the older you get, the more to the right of the graph we go, the higher the lines go. The index, the axis on the right, is the percentage who have a problem. So we could click a couple more times. So when do we have a situation where 50% of our older Canadians have a mild hearing loss? Well, that would be about when people get to be 75. And we're going to see if we carry on with the vision data. So you can click away. We're going to have the same kind of graph, mild vision loss, moderate vision loss. More people just have a mild loss as they get older. And about 50% have a vision loss when they're, oh, gee whiz, around 75. So this is more than half, the majority start to have these issues in their mid-70s. Okay, next slide. Okay, yeah. So now, well, what about having both at the same time? And again, just to look at who would have both a mild vision loss and a mild hearing loss. Well, now we have about half of those Canadians having both problems at the same time when we get to people in their mid-80s. And you're probably also thinking, well, that's starting to be when a lot of people begin to get dementia. So actually, you get your sensory loss, you get your hearing loss about 10 years before you get your cognitive loss. And the hearing loss that you have now will predict your likelihood of having a cognitive loss 10 years later. So this is kind of a gateway into what is the brain got to deal with when you're not getting the best possible input fed into the brain. Okay, next slide. All right, so now we add the balance. So now we've got hearing, vision, balance. Balance you need so that you can stand up and you don't fall over. Balance you need for walking. Balance you need for driving, actually, as well. And here we have the number of people who have just one problem or two problems or three problems. And you can see that the lines go up as people get older. And having all three of these is something that many of us are starting to experience, that they start out as little problems and then they combine, and sometimes, we just have to deal with a package, because when we go out in everyday life, we have to hear, we have to see, we have to walk. And all of these things have to work together. So it's kind of putting the whole thing together that affects us in everyday life. All right, next slide. So I would say, I have studied hearing for the last 40 years, and I feel that's very important. But actually, around the world now, people are understanding how important sensory factors are for healthy aging. And why is that? Well, it's not just ears and eyes. It's because we need to take in information so that we can live optimally, so that we can have fun, so that we can have a good quality of life, so that we can connect to others, so that we can talk, so that we can share experiences, as Myrna described in the first talk, so that we can experience our environment. We know if the doorbell's ringing, we know if a bird is singing, or we know if there's a piece of art in the room when we use our vision. And it's also important for monitoring ourselves. So we could not talk very easily if we could not hear ourselves. So actually being able to hear enables us to produce action with our mouth. Actually being able to hear and see enables us to, move our legs and walk without falling over or drive our car. So it's the connection within ourselves and to the world that senses allow us to do. So I'm a big fan of the importance of the senses to communication and participation. And I have to say, when I heard the first talk starting, I was thinking, oh, well, writing poetry and making art is something you do by yourself. But then what we all learned was that the joy of writing the poetry and reading it and sharing it and doing the art and talking about it, actually, it was the communication, I would say, that was part of the magic of what we learned about in the first session today. So communication and participation. And sometimes we do that with language. You're all getting a lot of language exercise, listening to us talk at you online here today. I'm not going to sing any songs though, so don't get worried. All right, next slide. Let's just think about, how do the senses and changes in our senses as we age actually connect to a very large number of health problems and also everyday activity, so why does it matter? Next slide. Okay, so this is a Dutch study. Lots of people across the a large adult age range, and almost 80% of them who said they had a hearing problem also reported at least one other chronic health condition. compared to people with normal hearing. So this is something, that actually begins early in life. And we would like to be able to make sure that, we are able to let people not fall into some of these other problems. So what kind of problems could they be? Next slide. So hearing loss is caused, by some things that are chronic health problems. If you have diabetes, you have a higher risk of a hearing loss, and certainly a vision loss. If you have cardiovascular disease or hypertension, you're also more likely to have these sensory problems. So there, the health condition could be causing you to have greater risk of having a sensory loss, but it works the other way around too. So if you have a hearing loss, all of the people who study population health have found time and time again that hearing loss puts you at increased risk for cognitive decline and dementia. Hearing loss puts you at risk for more falls and injuries. Hearing loss puts you at more risk for social isolation and loneliness, for depression, for frailty, and even for death. So this is beginning to sound pretty serious, but you can kind of see the chain reaction. So can we do anything about this? Let's keep going. Next slide. This is a very famous paper that made headlines in the New York Times back in 2013. It was done by some researchers at Johns Hopkins, and it was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. And it was looking at people who started out pretty much the same place at the beginning of the study. And then it looked at their scores on the tests that some of you might have had when you were being diagnosed for dementia or assessed for dementia. So the scores on that test, they go down over the years of the study, but they go down more for people in the hearing loss group than the normal group. So this is what I said, that, the hearing loss comes first, but then the decline into dementia comes later and faster if you have a sensory loss. So this is a pretty startling finding, and people with hearing loss, might have been pretty shocked to realize that they were at greater risk. Let's move on to the next slide. If in our study, using that Canadian longitudinal study of aging data that we had, we looked at many things. Executive function is, how your brain does planning, and memory is another really important part of cognition that is affected when you have dementia. We also looked at general health. So no matter what we looked at, we found the same kind of pattern. And that pattern was that, the problems that you would have, say in your general health, were significantly related if you only had hearing loss, only vision loss, or only a balance problem. But if you had two of them, so the orange bars, hearing and vision problems, hearing and balance problems, vision and balance problems, the problems that you have, your ratings of your general health get worse. And if you have all three of them, you're really going to have a lot of problems. So these things travel in a pack, and once you have one, you're more likely to have the other one, and then things rapidly become a challenge for you. Next slide. So how can hearing loss, you kind of would understand if you have a hearing loss, you don't hear your microwave beeping, or you don't hear a small bird chirping. But actually, hearing loss can affect how well your brain can work when you are doing things which might be needing your full attention. If you have a bit of a walking problem, you need your full attention to cross the road safely. And if you are also struggling to hear while you're struggling to walk, these things can compound and put you at a big disadvantage. The same is true for driving. So, it's not it's not just about the beeping of your microwave. It's about how do you get on in the everyday world. Next slide. One of my colleagues in our sensory cognitive group in the CCNA, Don Guthrie at Wilfrid Laurier, she looked at data from Ontario for all of the people over a number of years who had been in home care and long-term care. And she looked at how vision and hearing and cognition in combination and alone were related to how well people functioned, their communication difficulties. And, you know, the bottom line was that if you had some cognitive problems and you also had sensory problems, you know, that was a much more serious situation. Now, maybe we can't change your cognitive health once you have dementia, you know, but maybe we can change something about your hearing and your vision. Let's just have a look at a couple more slides for those of you who might like numbers. So we looked at, out of almost 300,000 people in home care in Ontario in those years, and we found that 1 in 5 had this triple whammy of hearing, vision, and cognitive problems altogether. So that's a lot of people who are dealing with this as a package. And how can we have a strategy for working on the pieces that we can do something about so that they don't have some of those other consequences to their functioning? Next slide. So this is over 100,000 people in long-term care, and 1 out of 3, so more of them, had this triple whammy. And so I think you can see where we're going. I'm kind of, you know, trying to tell you about sensory loss, but it really interacts and it really affects how you live with your dementia, and what can we do about it? So next slide, we're going to kind of turn a corner here and talk about sensory exercise. Okay, so you heard a lot in the first talk about how art, you know, would enable you to be creative and use your brain and communicate. And this is a kind of mental exercise. Plus, it's fun. It's always good if it's fun. So you get your emotions also working for you instead of against you. Instead of being depressed, you know, you can enjoy something. That's really important. So how could we do sensory exercise for the brain? And would that make any difference? Let's go to the next slide. All right. So one of the things that is kind of widely known, and I think it's a simple idea, you probably heard of the use it or lose it idea. Another way of saying that is if you stay active, that helps to keep your brain healthy. Okay, staying active. That is a very good thing for your brain health. And those activities could be physical activities, they could be cognitive activities, they could be sensory activities, they could be social activities, they could be physical activities. Okay, so all of these kinds of activity give your brain a workout as well as your muscles, as well as the other parts of your body and the other aspects of your health. And I like this definition of health, that health is the capacity of people to adapt to, respond to, or control life's challenges and changes. So it's not that things aren't going to change. It's that how do you come back and stay active? And I think a lot of people who are listening got some very good tips in the first talk. And this is a very important part of getting on and living your life as well as you can, even if some of your abilities are changing. If we go to the next slide, you know, how do you do that? Well, it really helps if you are doing activities in an environment that is easy. So it could be a physical environment. You know, it's a lot easier to hear if it's quiet than if it's too noisy. It's a lot easier to see if the light is good than if it's too dark. It could be the social environment because you go with your friends and you have a common activity in a group and people, you know, enjoy each other's company as opposed to, you know, not being able to do that. So we have to put together changes in our abilities with how do we get in a place, an environment where, you know, we can still have fun and do things and stay active. Next slide. I thought I would just, you know, for those of you who are thinking about how do I keep my brain healthy so that I don't get dementia, you know, the World Health Organization has come up with some review of the evidence about what are the things that people have studied which might make a difference to reduce your risk of cognitive decline. And this is the list. And I will draw your attention to the fact that the best evidence, if you want to do one thing that's going to be good for your brain health, it's probably physical activity. So that we have a pretty good, you know, belief that that is effective. So you've probably heard about this and the importance of walking, for example. Some of the other things you can do, you know, the evidence isn't as strong, but, you know, what do you eat? Do you have some cognitive training? Do you manage your hypertension and your diabetes? And down at the bottom of the list are some ideas where we don't have sufficient evidence yet, but it looks like it's a good idea to stay socially active and manage your depression and manage your hearing loss. And we've had very important literature coming out in the last few years about what are the risk factors that we could modify that lead to dementia. And hearing loss has been identified as the greatest potentially modifiable risk factor for dementia. So now we're hot on the trail of how do we actually find out if we really can modify it and reduce people's risks. Let's go on to the next slide. So physical activity is great. Cognitive activity is great. Social activity is great. And to do any of those things, you need a good way of using your senses to engage in those activities, but we don't know so much about the benefits of that. If we go to the next slide, what we do know from some research, and this is again research done at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore by a researcher called Michelle Carlson. She has a treatment, an intervention, if you like these fancy words, but basically it's for the seniors to become volunteers in kindergarten. And they have to take a training to be the teacher's assistant, and they have to commit to go so many hours a week. And they have done this for years, and there's very good evidence that this is good for the children, and it's also great for the seniors. It's good for their memory, it's good for their walking, it's good for changes in their brain, it's good for their social connections. Okay, so this is not something you have to go to a hospital for. It's not expensive. It's just what can you do in your community where you're going to be making music and talking, and probably they were doing some art too, and probably they were doing some writing and reading. So these are ordinary things, and you just have to find what you like, because you're never going to do anything if you don't enjoy it. So, you know, there are many, many choices that you have, and don't underestimate the value that this could give you. Next slide. In fact, I mean, this is I don't know if you've ever seen this kind of research, but this is research about your social relationships and your social connections, which was the story of Myrna in the first half of the talk. That if you have good social relationships, then you have a much better chance. Okay, so 50% increased survival, like you just live longer if you have stronger social relationships. So becoming socially isolated and withdrawing and becoming lonely, that is a slippery slope. So let's go to the next slide. These are the words of a woman with hearing loss who was about 80 years old. And she gave me this little note one day after a meeting of the Canadian Hard of Hearing Association. And she wrote, okay, so Myrna would have liked this. She was writing her story for me. When you are hard of hearing, you struggle to hear. When you struggle to hear, you get tired. When you get tired, you get frustrated, emotional. When you get frustrated, you get bored. Your brain starts to tune out. When you get bored, you quit. And then she said, but I didn't quit today. So we had a bit of discussion in the first half about perseverance. So, if things get tough, you can quit or you can persist. And how do you find a way to persist that is going to work for you? Next slide. So this idea of what do we change in the environment is making places more hearing accessible. Everybody knows you'd have ramps for wheelchairs or you'd have elevators for wheelchairs, but how do we actually make the world easier for you to use your hearing even if you start to have a hearing loss? That's something that we're interested in working on. Next slide. And so is the World Health Organization, and so is the Canadian government. So these initiatives called Age-Friendly Communities or Dementia-Friendly Canada, this is about changing the world so that it's not so hard to get out and do the things that you would enjoy doing, even if you have some cognitive loss, even if you have some sensory loss, even if you have some mobility loss. So we've got lots of ways we can improve those situations, lots of work to do. Next slide. All right, no, so you might have been afraid I was going to tell you that y'all had to go out and get a hearing aid. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of people with hearing problems who don't have hearing aids. And there are reasons we're trying to understand so that the people who might benefit from hearing aids have better access to them. But some of these problems may or may not be solved by a hearing aid. So we have to look at these other kinds of solutions like improving the environments and finding other ways of getting auditory information and getting auditory exercise. Next slide. Some of you may have seen some ads that imply that getting a hearing loss is going to prevent you from getting dementia, and that is absolutely an exaggeration with no evidence. Okay, so it's good to get a hearing aid if you need to hear things louder, and it's probably good for you to communicate. It probably is a good way to reconnect socially if that has been a problem for you, but do not be fooled by some of the misleading advertising that you may encounter, because there is no evidence that putting a hearing aid on your ear is no better than taking a pill. It's not going to prevent dementia and it's not going to cure it. So having said that, what are our other options here? Let's go on to the next slide. First of all, you should probably have a hearing test. I'm going to tell you that next week is World Hearing Day, and the World Health Organization is going to launch the first ever World Hearing Report, and they are going to recommend to all the member states that we have universal hearing screening in adults, because many people don't know they have a hearing loss and they haven't done anything about it. So you should at least know, and you should at least understand what your options are, because the people who don't know they have a hearing loss still have a risk that is elevated for lower cognition and social isolation. And that is really what we want to prevent. We don't want you to have losses in cognition and losses in social isolation. Next slide. This is, a little bit of one of the early studies we did with our Canadian longitudinal study on aging research. We looked at things measured in CLSA. How many people do you know in your social network? How many activities do you do when you participate socially? How many people are giving you support, information, love, somebody you can talk to, that kind of social support. How many people think they're lonely? Next slide. And we found out that people who have hearing loss, vision loss, or both, compared to people with normal sensory abilities, have poor social support and more loneliness. And the people with vision loss also had fewer friends that they interacted with and did fewer activities. So that's what we want to change. That is what we want to change. So now, next slide. What can you do about this? Have your hearing checked. Find out what your options are for technology. Find the places where you can go and you can function well. The restaurants, well, we're not going to restaurants anymore. In some ways, Zoom is a little easier because you don't have to deal with crowd noise. But where are the places where you can communicate? What theaters are the places, where you can hear well? What kinds of lectures? Many people like to hear lectures on Zoom because it's easier for them to hear. So find your technologies, if there's ones that could help you, your environments, that there's ones that could help you. But also, what do you choose for your activities? And this is a book that came out recently. It was just published a couple of months ago. It's by Canadians, and it's all about music and the aging brain. And it has chapters in there about music and dementia, a lot of good information. And I just pulled out one little quote, which talks about learning a foreign language or bilingualism and music training being some of the sensory exercises with hearing that you could do that improves your brain health. And it is a good thing for you if you've done that since you were a child, learned a second language, or been a bilingual since you were a kid, or learned music and played in an orchestra or sung since you were a kid, because your brain has become stronger because of that early exercise. It's also good if you have kept it up, but it's never too late to learn. So just like physical exercise, if you're looking for something to do, and a lot of people have done this during COVID, they've picked up a musical instrument and they continue to work online with other people. And that is excellent, excellent exercise for your brain. Next slide. So you're probably thinking, well, so what is so magical about music? Every country has a language. There's French and Russian and English, different languages, but everybody has a language. And every culture has music. And everybody does not become a musician, but it's actually something that a lot of people do, even if they're not a professional. And it's something people enjoy, even if they're not a professional. So why is it good for your brain, apart from it, being entertaining and fun? So maybe you would like to go to that activity. Well, in order to do language or music, the auditory system operates in time. I was kind of interested what Myrna was saying about it's not the or maybe it was Susan or both of them, that it's not just the product of art, it's the process. And there is no product. If you play a musical instrument, you play a song. There is no product, when you're talking in a conversation, unless you happen to record it, and then you can replay it. But it's kind of a little bit different because it's in the moment. Music and language are in the moment, and timing is really important. So what happens when people are musicians is their brain develops very precise timing and synchronization, and it allows all the parts of the brain to work together in a much smoother, more efficient way. So it kind of clears the cobwebs out of the brain to be doing music, and that is very interesting. It's this synchronization across brain areas and the connections between the talking part and the listening part, or the playing the piano and hearing it part. It's the connections, and it's creating, the motor, how do you play the keys on the piano? How do you read the music? How do you listen with your ears? It's making all those connections work together like a really well-oiled machine. Plus, it's fun. So it does have positive effects on memory and attention and how fast you can do thinking. It also is great for synchronizing behavior with others. So if you are singing together, you have to work together, you have to collaborate. And if you do it for any length of time, you can also start to share feelings that way. And you can share moods and some of the other things that were discussed in the first talk. And I think all of us have known people with dementia who, even after they get past the point where they can communicate by language, may be able to sing. My mother, at the end of her dementia, she really wasn't talking, but my goodness, she could sing every verse of some of the Second World War songs that she had learned when she was a younger person. So it stays a long time in the brain, and it's a way of harnessing some of those old memories and creating new connections. Next slide. So we had a little bit of exercise in the intermission. I hope you give some thought to exercising your senses, and music and singing and playing an instrument are all great ways to do that. So that's a fun thing you can do, and it's good for your brain and good for your mood and good for your social relationships. Next slide. Okay, so this is my message to you. Stay active, stay active. And you might have some hearing and vision loss, but it doesn't mean you can't stay active. And staying active and exercising your auditory system is a great way to exercise your brain. And then last slide. And I did say that next week is World Hearing Day, and that's a really kind of big day. So keep your eye out for that in the headlines. And hopefully we'll make a world where everybody has some ways of dealing with their hearing loss and from keeping their hearing healthy. And we'll look forward to some great new things coming forward as we connect some of these WHO worldwide hearing initiatives to initiatives connected to the UN Decade of Healthy Aging, which is also started this year. So hearing and aging are going to be worked on together from here henceforward. All right, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Kathy. That was, wow, I wrote down quite a few notes. I think there's some memorable things you said, like that some of these challenges travel in a pack. I will never forget that little metaphor. But I think the good news is that hearing loss is a modifiable risk factor, and I love the tactics and strategies that you gave us, and we'll definitely tune into World Hearing Day next week. So thank you so much for all the things that you've shared with us today. And now we're going to turn it over to you, the audience. And please write your questions into the chat box, and Christine will help for anyone who needs her help.
All right, so the first question in the chat box was about whether the levels of hearing loss that you mentioned were specific only to normal loss due to aging, or did that include hearing loss due to a specific cause, such as a viral infection destroying the audio nerve?
Well, that's a very good question. And a lot of the big population studies like CLSA, hearing is measured now. So we don't know when the person started to have a hearing problem. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And that is something that we need to do research on, because people who were born with a hearing loss and live their whole life that way, from a child, their brain was developing differently because it didn't have a normal auditory input. So your brain, there's a fancy word that it's plastic, you know, that actually learning means your brain is changing. And so when do you start having a hearing loss, and how does that alter the way your brain works? The people that I've worked the most with, the people who are the most common in the population, are people who live most of their adult life with very good hearing. But then by the time they get to be in their 40s, you know, they don't want to go to the pub anymore because it's too noisy to talk to their friends. And that can happen even if you go to have a hearing test and they tell you you have normal hearing, you have problems in noise first. And hearing aids don't really correct that. But that's kind of a sign that things are going wrong in the auditory nervous system. And that's kind of the precursor to some of these cognitive changes. So brain exercise, you know, the people who are withdrawing from activity are the ones who, like, it's too noisy for me to go to the bar. The people who've had hearing loss their whole life, you know, they are just smiling in the bar because they turn their hearing aid off and lip read. Not to minimize their problems, but, you know, the strategies people develop so that they can keep doing things, you know, it takes time. It can take 10 to 20 years between when a person first notices hearing problems in their late middle age to when they seek help. And people, it's like your hair going gray, you know, it goes gray one hair at a time, and then you don't notice that you have gray hair, but your friend who you didn't see for 6 months will notice that difference. So they're very slow changes, and there are also different kinds of changes with age. Some are more affecting the nerves, and some are affected by cardiovascular factors. Some are affected by noise. And the different types of hearing loss and how they relate to different types of dementia are the kinds of things that we're studying now. Anyway, it's not simple, and we just need to know a lot more.
Well, Kathy, thanks for giving us this introductory lesson on what we need to know and putting this in the forefront of our minds, because you've given us some strategies we can use. Thank you so much. This is all the time we have for questions at the moment, but do let us know what your questions are, and we'll definitely do our best to find answers for them. So I want to thank you so much for joining us for the virtual Dialogue on Aging presentation. The recording of the session will be posted and available on the Dialogue on Aging public presentation website soon. The Alzheimer's Society of BC, we're so pleased to be a partner with Providence House for the series. Now I'm going to turn it over to Mary Lou, who has some surprising news for us for next the April session.
Yes, I'm very excited to tell you that in April for our next session, we are going to have the very great pleasure of having Isabel McKenzie, our seniors advocate for BC. You will have heard her, I'm sure, in terms of on various interviews, etc. You may have heard of very significant reports that she and her teams have done during COVID-19, and so she will be with us on April 8th. In fact, she said, I will be delighted to be with you and to present on whatever kind of the current issue is at that moment, and also leave plenty of time for questions, from you. So join us then, and thank you all for attending and for being part of this very engaging couple of hours we've had. So best wishes.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.